The sun had barely crested the jagged peaks of the Sierra Nevada when Mark Patterson tightened the straps on his backpack and stepped onto the narrow trail. It was early September and the air was crisp, carrying the earthy scent of pine needles and damp soil. He'd been looking forward to this solo trip for months, a week of solitude in the backcountry away from the hum of city life in Georgia. He carried a modest pack, a lightweight tent, a sleeping bag, a small stove, a handful of energy bars, and enough water purification tablets to last a week. He thought he was prepared, but he didn't yet know how unprepared he truly was. The trail started off easy, winding through open meadows where wildflowers still clung stubbornly to life, despite the approaching autumn. Birds called overhead, and the distant river sparkled like silver in the morning sun. Mark felt a familiar rush, freedom, independence, and the thrill of the unknown. He had planned a loop, roughly 30 miles, through rugged terrain that promised both challenge and isolation. By late afternoon, the easy stretches were gone. The trail became rocky, the trees denser, and the temperature began to drop. Mark's boots crunched over frost-tipped needles. He stopped to check his map. That's when he realized the first mistake. The trail markers had become sparse, and he had misread a junction. He thought he was following the correct path, but he had veered off, unknowingly heading deeper into the heart of the wilderness. The first night brought a biting cold that seeped through his thin sleeping bag. Mark huddled in his tent, ears straining for the sounds of wildlife. Somewhere nearby, a coyote howled, and the wind rattled branches against the canvas. Sleep came in short bursts, punctuated by shivers and the occasional sense of unease. He told himself that he would retrace his steps in the morning and get back on course. Morning revealed a frost-kissed landscape, and Mark packed quickly, anxious to correct his course. But every bend in the trail looked unfamiliar. He drank water from a small stream, using his purification tablets with careful precision. Hunger gnawed at him, but he still had energy bars, barely enough to sustain him for the next few days if he rationed carefully. As he climbed higher, the trees thinned, giving way to steep slopes strewn with loose rocks. One misstep could send him tumbling, and he felt a knot of fear tighten in his stomach. By midday, a sudden storm rolled in. Dark clouds obscured the peaks, and rain began to lash his face. Mark hurried to find shelter, spotting a shallow overhang among the boulders. He pressed himself against the cold rock, wrapping his arms around his chest, trying to stay dry. The storm lasted hours. Every bolt of lightning illuminated the sheer drops and sheer cliffs that surrounded him, and he realized how vulnerable he truly was. The wind howled through the rocks like a living thing, and Mark's confidence began to waver. As evening fell, the storm eased but left the terrain slick and treacherous. Mark attempted to navigate again, but the trail had vanished under mud and fallen branches. Exhaustion was settling in. His stomach ached from hunger, his muscles screamed from constant climbing, and a dull pain in his right ankle. He had twisted it earlier, reminded him of how fragile his situation was. He found a narrow ledge to camp on, wedging his backpack under his head for a pillow. The stars peeked through a break in the clouds, but their beauty did little to calm his racing thoughts. He was lost, truly lost, and the realization hit him in the pit of his stomach. He could be out here for days. By the third day, Mark's situation had worsened. His energy bars were nearly gone. He had drunk most of his water, and the streams were farther apart than he anticipated. Every step required careful consideration. The injury in his ankle had worsened. Simple walking left him hobbling and breathless. He began marking trees with scraps of tape torn from his pack, a small thread of hope that he could track his own path back. The silence of the mountains pressed down on him, broken only by the occasional rush of wind or distant bird call. The loneliness was profound, almost suffocating. On that third evening, he tried to light a small fire to cook the last of his dehydrated meal, but wet wood refused to catch. The fire's smoke, usually comforting, now mocked him. He wrapped himself tightly in his sleeping bag, knees pulled to his chest, listening to the creaking of the trees and the whisper of unseen streams below. Hunger gnawed at his gut, thirst pricked at his throat, and for the first time, panic started to creep in. The mountains were beautiful, yes, but they were indifferent. Survival was no longer a question of comfort, it had become a question of will. The fourth morning arrived gray and heavy with fog. Mark's ankle throbbed relentlessly, each step sending sharp jolts of pain up his leg. His energy bars were gone. Hunger had transformed from a mild gnaw into a constant gnawing ache, and his mouth was dry despite the few sips of rainwater he had managed to collect in a dented metal cup. He knew he had to move, to find water and shelter before he became truly immobilized. But every step felt like climbing a wall. The fog reduced visibility to a few meters. Shadows of trees blurred together, and every rock and root looked like a trap waiting to catch him. He slowed his pace, gripping a sturdy branch like a crutch. Each footfall was cautious. Slipping now could mean a broken bone, and in this isolation, even a minor injury could be fatal. Hours passed in a silent rhythm of step, stumble, pause, pain, breath. Around midday, he stumbled upon a narrow creek trickling down a mossy incline. Relief surged through him. He knelt beside it, cupping the icy water in his hands. He drank slowly, savoring each sip as if it were a tiny victory. Using his portable water filter, he filled his bottle, then sat on a damp boulder, letting exhaustion wash over him. He closed his eyes, listening to the whisper of the water, trying to quiet the fear that gnawed at the edges of his mind. By afternoon, the fog lifted slightly, revealing jagged peaks above and valleys that disappeared into the mist below. Mark realized he had wandered farther than he thought. The map in his hands felt like a stranger's handwriting, lines and symbols that no longer made sense. Panic bubbled beneath the surface, but he forced himself to breathe, to ration his thoughts, to move slowly and deliberately. As evening approached, clouds rolled in again, heavy and dark. Mark's ankle had swollen noticeably, and the cold damp began to seep into his bones. He knew he needed shelter before nightfall. After stumbling through a thick stand of pines, he found a rocky alcove, just large enough to shield him from the wind. He crawled inside, pressing his back to the stone, and using his pack as a barrier against the wet ground. Hunger and fatigue were constant companions now. Every muscle ached, every joint screamed. The isolation pressed in. The forest, once inviting, now felt like a living, breathing adversary. The nights were the hardest. Without a fire, the cold was merciless. He layered his clothing and buried himself in his sleeping bag, but shivers still racked his body. He tried to sleep, but every noise, a branch snapping, distant howls, jerked him awake, heart hammering. His mind wandered to thoughts of Georgia, his family, the familiar streets, the warm kitchen, the sense of safety that now seemed a lifetime away. He forced himself to push those thoughts aside, to focus on survival, water, shelter, movement. By the 7th day, Mark was running low on both physical strength and mental reserves. Hunger was raw now, even moss and root seemed tempting, a testament to how desperate he had become. His ankle made each step a negotiation with pain. He improvised a crude splint from a branch and strips of fabric from his shirt, wrapping it tightly around the joint. Every movement was a gamble, and every shadow along the trail sparked anxiety. A small glimmer of hope came when he spotted what he thought was smoke in the distance. Adrenaline surged as he stumbled toward it, half running, half limping, but as he drew closer, it dissolved into a trick of sunlight on wet rocks. Disappointment hit like a punch to the chest, but it also reminded him why he had to keep moving. Every mistake had a cost here, and the mountains would not forgive hesitation. On the 10th day, the weather turned bitterly cold, with the first hints of snow at higher elevations. Mark shivered constantly, teeth chattering even inside his soaked sleeping bag. He rationed water and chewed on small roots, trying to keep some semblance of energy. His thoughts flickered between hope and despair. Sometimes he whispered to himself, reciting the names of rivers, roads, and towns, trying to anchor his mind to something familiar. Other times, he simply sat, shivering, listening to the wind, feeling the weight of isolation pressing down like a physical force. By the end of this grueling stretch, Mark realized survival was no longer just about food or water. It was about patience, endurance, and an almost meditative focus on the next step, the next decision. The mountains were relentless, beautiful, and terrifying all at once. Each day was a test of body and mind, and as he drifted into a restless sleep on that 10th night, he knew that the battle for survival had only just begun. The 11th day began with a biting wind that cut through even Mark's multiple layers of clothing. His ankle, now swollen and stiff, made each movement agonizing. Snow dusted the rocky slopes, transforming the landscape into a treacherous maze of white and gray. Visibility was limited, and every step had to be measured. One slip could send him tumbling down the steep inclines. Hunger gnawed relentlessly at his gut, and thirst began to creep back in despite the snow and small streams he had been rationing. By mid-morning, he realized he had been walking in circles. The markers he had left on trees days earlier were obscured by snow and wind, and the streams that should have guided him seemed to have shifted with the terrain. Panic tried to rise again, but he clenched his teeth and forced it down. He remembered the training videos, the survival guides he had watched before this trip. Signal for help, conserve energy, find water, stay put if lost. But the mountains were indifferent, offering no mercy. Around noon, he spotted a small cave tucked under a jagged outcrop of rocks. It was narrow, damp, but it offered protection from the wind. Mark crawled inside, shivering uncontrollably, and pressed his forehead against the cool stone. His body was exhausted, his mind fraying at the edges. He tried to sleep, but cramps and hunger woke him repeatedly. Outside, the wind howled through the rocky cliffs like a predator circling its prey. That night, hunger became unbearable. The little energy he had left was dwindling rapidly. He gnawed on scraps of pine bark and small roots, chewing carefully to extract whatever nutrients he could. Each bite was bitter and fibrous, but it was sustenance, and sustenance was survival. The cold seemed to reach into his bones, and Mark wrapped himself as tightly as he could in his sleeping bag, rocking slightly back and forth, whispering his own name to remind himself he was still alive. The 12th day brought an unexpected challenge: heavy snowfall. The landscape transformed overnight into a monochrome labyrinth, hiding rocks, holes, and the trail he had been trying desperately to follow. Every step became a gamble. His ankle made it nearly impossible to traverse the slippery terrain, but he knew he could not remain in one place forever. Hunger and cold made thought sluggish, but he kept moving, focusing only on the next step, the next breath, the next small goal. Mid-afternoon, he slipped on a patch of ice and tumbled down a short slope, bruising his shoulder and cutting his palm on a jagged rock. Pain radiated through him, sharp and relentless, but he gritted his teeth and dragged himself to a safer spot. He found a tiny stream partially covered by snow, and he drank cautiously, letting the icy water restore a fraction of his fading strength. He realized he needed to find more substantial shelter soon, or risk succumbing to exposure. By the 14th day, Mark had accepted the reality. He was no longer just a lost camper. He was a survivor battling the relentless Sierra Nevada. He began experimenting with small survival tricks, melting snow in his metal cup for drinking water, layering moss and pine needles under his sleeping bag for insulation, and moving only when he knew he could safely navigate. His body ached constantly, his ankle throbbed with every step, and hunger had hollowed his stomach. Yet a stubborn will kept him going, each day a testament to human endurance. Late in the afternoon, he caught sight of movement in the trees, a distant herd of deer grazing cautiously. Their presence sparked something in him, a fleeting sense of hope and normalcy, a reminder that life continued around him even as his own struggle felt infinite. Mark paused to watch, drawing strength from their calm vigilance, and for a brief moment the weight of fear lifted. That night he huddled, in a makeshift snow and branch shelter, the wind howling like a chorus of ghosts outside. He whispered to himself, recounting every step, every stream, every rocky incline. The days had blurred together, morning and night indistinguishable except by the faint glimmer of light on snow. Hunger and exhaustion were constant companions, yet he refused to give in. Somewhere inside, a flicker of determination burned. He would survive. He would see another sunrise. By the 15th day, the realization set in fully. He had outlasted the first half of this ordeal, but the mountains were still relentless, still indifferent. Mark understood now that survival was not a linear journey. It was a series of tiny victories, a constant negotiation with pain, fear, and exhaustion. And somewhere beyond the next ridge, beyond the next treacherous slope, hope waited, if only he could reach it. The 16th day began with an almost imperceptible shift in the wind, a hint of warmer air, a promise that the storm had passed. Mark's body was battered, his ankles swollen and stiff, cuts on his hands and arms scabbed over, muscles screaming with every movement. Hunger and fatigue had become second nature. Each step was a careful calculation of energy versus distance, yet somewhere deep inside, the faintest ember of hope persisted. By mid-morning, he spotted a ridge that promised a view over the valley below. He dragged himself upward, gripping rocks and roots, ignoring the sharp pains shooting through his ankle. When he finally crested it, the sight stole his breath, a ribbon of green forest winding toward what looked like a road, faint but unmistakable. His heart surged. For the first time in over 2 weeks, he felt the possibility of rescue, of safety, of returning to life beyond these peaks. He began descending cautiously, aware that the snow-matted ground could betray him at any moment. Every step was slow, deliberate, testing the stability of rocks and ice. Hunger gnawed fiercely, but adrenaline now fueled him more than anything else. He scavenged along the way, small berries, a handful of moss, even an occasional root, just enough to keep his strength from collapsing entirely. Night fell before he reached the lower valley. Exhaustion weighed on him like a physical force, and sleep beckoned, but he forced himself to press on, crawling through underbrush, climbing over fallen logs, until he found a small creek. Here, he made a minimal shelter with branches and pine needles, pressing himself into it for warmth. The sounds of the valley, the rush of water, the rustle of nocturnal animals, were a stark contrast to the oppressive silence of the high mountains. Relief coursed through him, mingled with pain and fatigue, and he allowed himself a few minutes of quiet gratitude. By the 18th day, Mark's body was near breaking point, but the valley below promised salvation. Following the creek, he finally spotted tire tracks cutting through the forest floor, proof of human presence. His heart pounded with a mixture of disbelief and hope. He called out, voice hoarse from days of disuse, and waited. The wind carried his desperate cries, and for a moment silence answered. Then, faintly, the sound of voices in return. The 19th day brought the culmination of his ordeal. Local rangers, responding to reports of a missing hiker, appeared on the path, silhouetted against the rising sun. Mark's voice broke as he called to them, staggering forward, tears mixing with grime and blood. They rushed to his side, wrapping him in blankets and offering water, food, and words of reassurance. He collapsed into their arms, sobbing uncontrollably, relief and exhaustion blending into an overwhelming wave. As he sat by the warmth of their campfire, sipping soup and listening to the crackle of flames, Mark reflected on the past 19 days. The Sierra Nevada had been merciless, indifferent, and beautiful in ways he had never imagined. Every moment had been a negotiation with fear, pain, and the unknown. Yet through it all, he had survived, not because of preparation alone, but because of endurance, determination, and an unyielding will to live. The mountains receded behind him as he was flown to safety, but their lessons stayed. Every ache, every scrape, every sleepless night etched a memory into him, a reminder of the fragile line between life and death. And though he would carry scars and stories for the rest of his life, he knew one undeniable truth. He had faced the unforgiving wilderness alone, and he had come out alive.